Welcome to the Albert Clark Show, a transformative podcast where we embark on a profound journey through the key themes of life. Join us as we delve into the rich narratives woven into the works of acclaimed author Albert Lynn Clark, known for his compelling novels Lightning and Thunder, A Miracle Love Story, An Ancient Destiny, Escape from Earth. In each episode, we will explore essential life topics such as miracles, love, hope, loss, destiny, and transformation. Through heartfelt discussions, personal stories, and insightful interviews with guests, Albert will guide us in understanding how these themes shape our lives and connect us to one another. Whether you're seeking inspiration, healing, or a deeper understanding of your own journey, this podcast is designed to resonate with your heart and mind. Tune in as we celebrate the currents of life that unite us all, illuminating the path toward love, hope, and personal growth.
A testament of faith, a beacon of light.
Hello, people. This is Albert Clark. I thought I'd start off with saying that I don't have a script. I am given a subject and asked to speak on it, and the word I got for today is loss or grief. Well, I'll try to discuss both. First of all, I lost a penny. I dropped it, and it rolled into a drain in the street, and it was gone forever. That's not a big loss, but it's technically a loss. And there are other losses. I lost money in the stock market, but I made money in the stock market. Then there's a loss where it's something personal. My first big loss was I had a dog that I had grown up with from the time I was about 4 years old. I lived in a very small town, and my dog would get loose out of the fence or climb the fence or whatever. Anyway, he would show up at school a couple hours after I left for school, and he would sneak into the building somehow and then go through the cloak room, which we had a coat closet basically for each room. And he would go through the coat closet and sneak into the back of the room and then lay by my chair in the classroom. And none of the other grade school students would say anything. He would just lay there and be very quiet. And when the teacher would notice him, sometimes they'd ask me to take the dog out, and I would, but he would be back. Anyway, it was a small town, and the dog went to school with me on a regular basis. There was no way to get. One time he was chained up outside, and he brought the whole chain with him along with the stake that it was tied to, and came rattling through the school hallway and down the coat closet and by my bed and laid down, chain and all, laying out behind him. That didn't work. Took the chain off. Didn't try that again. But anyway, he would sneak out of the house. He would sneak through the fence. He would go over the fence, whatever. He was just a small Cocker Spaniel, but they're awfully strong for their size. And he was my constant companion. He would go out and on the playground, and he'd watch me while I'm playing with the other kids. And then he'd sneak back into the school, and pretty soon he'd be right beside my chair again. So the teachers sort of gave up on him. Anyway, it was a small town. We had first and second grade in the same classroom with the same teacher. That kind of small school where we had, 8 or 10 students in each class, and so total classroom size would maybe be 20, 25 at most. And so they let him do that because he definitely did not disturb anybody. You just had to make sure you didn't step on him. Anyway, I had gone off to college, and I came home to my parents' house, which was 130 miles from the school. And he naturally wanted to sleep with me. And my father said, make sure you take him out. And so I took him out, and I should have stayed with him, but I didn't. I went in and watched another TV show, and I went out to bring him in. and discovered he'd died. And so that was not only a loss, but also guilt. Why did I not just go outside and stay with him and bring him back in immediately? It was really cold outside that night, and he thought he'd been dismissed for life. So he did die. Anyway, so that was loss, grief, and also guilt. So sometimes when we have a major loss like that, there's usually guilt associated with. A few years later, I was off in the military. I was stationed in Utah, and my parents and grandparents were all in Oklahoma. And I discovered that my grandmother, who was in her 80s, and just a couple of years before, had driven all the way halfway across the country to Seattle, Washington, to visit one of her sisters and come back. And she had some eye problems, so she had eye surgery, and she thought that was the end of her driving. So I called her in the hospital, and she sounded very chipper and happy. But she told me she's going to die before morning. Well, I guess I should have immediately called my mother to tell her that my grandmother had said she was going to die that night, even though she didn't sound sick. She supposedly was going to get out of the hospital the next day. And anyway, I got in the car and I started driving. And I drove halfway across the United States. Uh, and by the time I got there, she had died that morning, just a few hours after I'd talked to her on the telephone. So again, that was a loss, grief, and guilt. Why didn't I call somebody to say that my grandmother had said that? Well, that's a loss, and she was a great woman. Matter of fact, when she was 80 years old, she'd gone back to the University of Oklahoma to take some more classes. Uh, the family is very oriented to college education, and almost all of my aunts had even graduated from college. Well, I didn't know my grandfather on that side of the family. Uh, he had died very young from Parkinson's, and I didn't even remember. I remember seeing some pictures of him, but that's about it because they didn't have a whole lot of cameras back then. And my grandmother, I remember her from a few times where we were visiting, and I watched her uh, uh, gardening or whatever from climbing a tree and looking down on her. But I don't really remember her very much. And I was still maybe 6 or 7 years old when she died. Uh, Now, my grandfather on that side of the family, he was a farmer and he was strong. He was only 5'7" and skinny, but he had bulging muscles because he worked his farm clear up into his 90s. And he got in a fist fight with his older brother, came home with the whole side of his face bruised because they were apparently he had stolen his older brother's girlfriend that he was engaged to and moved to Oklahoma with her and bought up several farms from farmers that had gotten land grants, but didn't know how to farm, so they sold their property real cheap. Of course, they only paid $1 for 40 acres, but anyway, he bought up several of them together to have it where he had a large farm. And um, she was in her 80s when she died, but I was still young. And I remember my grandfather real well because uh, uh, he was just a great guy, very friendly, very religious, uh, but they just took the life out of him. And he had a stroke a few weeks later, and he seemed to be recovering from the stroke. And then he had another stroke, and that was the end of him. And he was, at that time, because of the first stroke, he was living with us in our house. I don't feel any guilt over him, but it was a great loss because he was a great guy, he was a great talker. He told stories. He didn't repeat stories. He told new stories each time about his growing up, and So he definitely did not have Alzheimer's, but he just sort of gave up when he had that second stroke, and that was a loss. And not really grief because he was, really old and just sort of lost his enthusiasm for living, and especially after that second stroke and after a fight with his brother. And but there was no guilt associated there. And then I had some friends that died along the way, uh, and those were losses. We didn't have grief counselors back then. When I graduated, I went to a large high school with 2,000 students, and we had one psychology person there whose main job was to give aptitude tests and to give college testing programs for the ACT and so forth to get college entrances. But we didn't have grief counseling. If somebody got killed in a car accident, we went to the funeral and we said, sorry that they're gone. There was no guilt. There was loss of having lost a friend. Uh, but there was not really grief, and we didn't have grief counselors. So people didn't get all uptight about the fact they lost a friend. They said, well, he shouldn't have been driving so fast, or well, it's too bad that he caught that terminal disease, or too bad that he had cancer. But it wasn't guilt, and it wasn't really even grief, but it was a loss. And then things got more personal as I started losing my older cousins in their 80s, that for one reason or another they died, and those were losses. But it wasn't really grief, and it wasn't really any guilt associated with that. But it was definitely a loss. And as I get older, I lose more and more friends. I lose more and more uh, relatives that, in their 80s or 90s. And I have one cousin that's 90 years old and he still snow skis. Ooh. And he was also one of the most brilliant people in the United States working on stuff he couldn't talk about for the government. And so I never talked about his work, but he worked in strange places, worked at different companies, even though he was a government employee. Uh, he worked on various different islands where they were doing nuclear testing and so forth. But anyway, he still is healthy. He broke a leg, and 2 years later, he was back on the ski slopes at Park City, Utah. So anyway, uh, uh, and then we came to the big loss. I had met my wife. We were married for 45 years, and she had various different surgeries over the years because uh, she was riding a horse when she was early teens, and somebody threw a cherry bomb, a large firecracker, underneath the horse while she was sitting sideways, bareback on a 2-year-old stallion, which of course took off and left her sitting there in the air, 5 feet in the air above the ground, and she landed right on her hips. And so when she got into her getting close to 60 years old, those hips were giving her a lot of pain. So she had hip replacements on both hips. Uh, but that wasn't really a loss because it just slowed her down for a while. But she was back on a horse 4 months after the first hip surgery. And she asked the doctor, should I be riding a horse? And he said, no, I would definitely recommend against that. I'm not worried about the hip I replaced. I'm worried about the other hip that I have not replaced yet. So anyway, a few years later, she got that hip replaced also. Uh, and then when she died, uh, I'm very thankful I had great insurance that paid for her different surgeries like heart surgery and so forth, but she survived and she was doing well. And uh, but one thing I feel very guilty about is the fact she had asthma since she was 15 years old and always had a inhaler. You see them on advertised on television where this father is playing catch with a young son, and all of a sudden he starts gasping for air and gets out his inhaler, and then he's okay again. Well, when we moved to Florida, uh, when we were 60 years old, the doctors there would refuse to give her an inhaler prescription and told her to just use Primatene. Well, that's not as good as the prescription inhalers that she had uh, prescribed to her by the U.S. Air Force when I was in the Air Force, or by our private doctors before we moved to Florida. But Primatene would work, just not as fast and not as well, and it'd take her longer to get over it. Instead of getting over it within 15 minutes with the other inhalers, it would take her hours before she'd start feeling good again. Anyway, I feel guilty because when they wouldn't give her an inhaler, she had to get by with Primatene, and I wanted her to go to an asthma doctor, but we couldn't find one. And then they took Primatene off the market because it used Freon as the accelerant to, force the medicine into the throat to stop the asthma attack. And then they took that off the market because of Freon, and therefore she had no inhaler. So we went to our regular doctor, and he said he recommended we go to a lung specialist. So we go to a lung specialist, and he starts giving her COPD medication, which actually made things worse instead of better. So she had no inhaler for asthma. And then at 72 years old, we went on a cruise. And to give you an idea of her asthma, she was the president of a 300-member line dance group and did country line dancing for 2 hours every Monday. And on Tuesday and Thursday and sometimes Saturday, she went and did aquasizer pools exercise where she'd go to the swimming pool and they would do jumping jacks and running in place and things like that in the swimming pool. So she was very fit. And we'd been on a cruise the week before, and we danced every single dance to a rock and roll group for 2 hours before midnight when the ship's band quit for the night. And we stayed up for another hour playing games with an MC that's playing games. And that was on Saturday night. On Sunday, we went to a Broadway musical. On Monday, she was the maid of honor at a wedding on a dock in this retirement community we lived in Florida. And Friday, she was going to have dinner for the newlyweds and take them to a local nightclub for dancing. And she went to the grocery store to buy fresh rolls. And I went to the wine department to buy some red wine because we didn't have any red wine, and the bride liked red wine. So I went to get wine. She went the other way to get rolls, and we were supposed to meet back at the cash register. And when I came back, she wasn't there. So I went looking for her, and I found her in the cut flower aisle with hundreds and hundreds of cut flowers in the grocery store. And she was blocked in by shopping carts with people that didn't speak English who would not move. I had to shove them out of the way to get to her. She was hanging onto this huge 10-foot square table full of cut flowers, trying to keep from falling. And I took her straight to the hospital to get a shot of epinephrine or EpiPen and a breathing treatment for her asthma. The doctor there said that she had COPD for 9 years and claimed that she was bedridden with a home nurse and home oxygen for 9 years, and I should expect that she's going to die any moment now. Well, I tried to argue. My wife had already given the hospital and her primary care doctor a living will or advance directive says don't ever put her on life support. But they ignored me. They ignored the letter. uh, and they said they were going to give her an EpiPen, but I had to leave the room. Well, we'd been at that hospital before. She got an EpiPen, a breathing treatment, and we went home. And within a couple of hours, she was fine again. And it wouldn't happen for another 5 or 6 months before she would have another asthma attack. I'd take her to the hospital, get an EpiPen. Anyway, they chased me out of the room, and then I heard her yelling. I heard the doctor yelling. I couldn't get the door open because they'd locked me out completely. And when she came out of the room, she had been strapped down and put on a breathing machine. And then they overdosed her for everything because according to her medical record, she was 5'4" and weighed 150 pounds, but she was really 5'0" and weighed 106 pounds. The most she ever got to in her life was 115 pounds, which is far short of 150 pounds. And she had to stretch to be 5 foot because she didn't want to be 4 foot something. And they overdosed her on everything because they got her size wrong. And of course, they didn't want her fighting. So uh, now let me back up a little bit. When we first actually met, uh, 45 years earlier, it was during a lightning storm. At the exact moment she died, 15 days after she went into the hospital, the whole hospital, she took her last breath, and the entire hospital shook like it was an earthquake. And a big boom of thunder, and all the lights went out. And the emergency generator was even burned out completely. So battery power took 3 minutes before it came back on, and her heart monitor was flatlined. That was grief, anger, major loss, because she was like half of my life. Well, she was more than half of my life. Everything I did was somehow for her. Me working was to earn money to be able to do things with her. Uh, that's the depth of grief. uh, I have had encounters multiple times that had to have been from God that told me she's still alive in heaven. Every night I say a prayer 3 times at least, uh, praying that when I die, I will be with her as her husband again, and we can live forever as a happily married husband and wife in heaven, and still visit Earth and whatever, but we'll be in another dimension. Anyway, so that is true grief, the worst grief you can imagine. I still sometimes I'll be watching television and a sob will escape my mouth because I'm at the verge of crying, because I feel guilty that I didn't insist on her going to a asthma doctor. I tried to get her to go to other doctors to get to get a prescription inhaler, but she refused to go because for 6 or 8 months out of the year she'd be fine, and then she'd have another asthma attack, and take her to the hospital, get a EpiPen, get a breathing treatment, and she'd be fine again for another 5 or 6 months. But I should have forced her somehow to go to another doctor to get a inhaler. So anyway, that is the depths of grief. I will never recover. That's over 9 years ago. Uh, I appreciate pretty girls. I like pretty girls. I'm attracted to pretty girls, but they're not my wife. And so I will never, ever marry again or be close to another female. I say I like females. I've got a lot of female friends, but they're just friends. I might even go to a movie with them, but I'm not going to go any further than that. I might take them out to for coffee in the morning, but I'm not going to take them to bed in the night. So anyway, I know grief. How do you recover from grief? I don't know. Uh, if I was 30 years younger, maybe the hormones would cause me to find another girlfriend. Um, I'm one that I'll be walking down the street and a pretty girl will stop me to just say hello. But I'm not interested in them. Um, I don't go to bars. I don't go to dances. I don't do much of anything except exist. So anyway, I've written a bunch of books, and I'm hoping they will become movies because the love I felt with my wife was related strictly to God and miracles. So with that, I'll close this podcast and see what my next topic will be. Because again, I don't have a script. I'm just given a word or two and said, talk on that subject. I said, okay. So this is my talk on loss or grief. That's the end. I'll find out what my next topic is sometime soon. Goodbye.
Light